Well, I think a review of the organisation of the Defence Forces and our defence policy is strategically necessary, and I welcome the opportunity to participate in it. But I'd have to say that unless we correct the fundamental flaws and contradictions in the Green Paper, which the Minister has reiterated tonight and which has consistently been the position of this government and the previous one, that unless we address this, then we are missing an opportunity. We're doing a disservice to the citizens of the state, and particularly to the men and women who make up our defence forces, because the Green Paper and what we've heard so far represents, in my opinion, a continuation of a deeper integration into the EU, the US and the NATO military access. I think, as Raymond Dean pointed out, the paper itself never quite comes to grips with the contradiction between the stated neutrality and yet the ongoing commitment to EU common security and defence policy. And consistently, neutrality is misrepresented throughout the paper, even getting it wrong in the context of where neutrality came from, saying it was developed in the course of World War II, when, as Deputy McLaughlin said, our neutrality has been a key and intrinsic part of the battle of this country for independence and rooted in our identity, from the writings of Wolfe Tone in the 1790s to James Connolly's Irish Neutrality League, to the terms negotiated by Michael Collins, indeed, where the demand for perpetual Irish neutrality was part of that, and the recent opinion polls which show that Irish people hold neutrality dear. And as Deputy Wallace said, the best defence of our realm and the best contribution to world peace that we can make is one of active neutrality. And that doesn't mean talking neutrality while in reality taking sides. It doesn't mean bandying around words like military neutrality when the courts of this land have shown that this state have actually breached our neutrality. And I think in that context, it is frankly astoundingly and gobsmackingly brazen that there isn't a single mention of the use of Shannon in the Green Paper. Not one. I mean, it's almost beyond belief. And yet today, as Deputy Wallace said, we hear talk about the government and the department being worried about lone wolf terrorist attacks. But meanwhile, a whole pack of wolves are transiting through Shannon on a daily basis, and we don't have a problem with that at all. And the reality is that that is the biggest threat to the security of the state. And I don't say it lightly. I say it in the context of the evidence presented in court. In our case, 2 military experts, some who talked about interviewing Hezbollah agents, who talked about an airport in County Clare, which was facilitating the use by the US military. I honestly think that if there ever was a lone wolf attack in Ireland, it would probably be in retaliation for the use of Shannon. And it's tragic that we're having this discussion against the backdrop of the loss of Irish lives in Tunisia by a lone wolf terrorist who targeted Westerners, and our citizens were the victim of that. Now, Minister, you talked tonight about preventing transnational terrorist groups from using our state as a refuge or a base from which to direct their activities and targets to other countries. I agree with you. We should not allow our state as a base for terrorists on their way to other countries. But is that not what's happening with Shannon? With the devastation in the Middle East and North Africa, facilitated by millions of troops transiting through Shannon. And I think the problem here is throughout the Green Paper there is a conscious blurring of the lines. We talk about the Partnership for Peace, but it really is linked to closer alliances with NATO. I think there's a deliberate, and there has been consistently anyway, undermining of the triple lock. I think you'd probably love to be part of the coalition of the willing. We know from the WikiLeaks cables that the Americans think that we are. There's talk about constraints of the United Nations sanction, which is a key part of our triple lock provision. Well, the Irish people like that constraint. We like to have UN sanction if we're going to be involved in any of that. And when the paper talks about where permanent members of the Security Council...
Please. Deputy Daly has the floor.
So why are you focusing on something that's not changing?
It's implicit in all of your antics and tactics, not just in the Green Paper, but in your ongoing operation of the department. I think if you look, and I agree strongly with the serious concern by many citizens of really what is the process of military Keynesianism, where you did it again tonight, and linked military spending to economic growth and activity, and against the backdrop of the existence of the European Defence Agency, which is in reality a front for the international arms trade, I think that's pretty reprehensible. I've no doubt that there's a huge amount of money to be made from the securitisation of Europe, but you know what? I think our money would be far better spent on other things. Like, for example, you might look at the conditions of the members of our defence forces whose living standards have been butchered. You talk about dealing with veterans of our army when their widows and families are being driven out of army accommodation in the Curragh camp. You talk about a not onerous litigation process when victims of being prescribed Lariam have to take cases before the court, and Donald DeRocha has to wait 40 years for justice. So if you want to spend money, spend them on the personnel, not on ever-increasing hardware. I think it would be far better to do that. I think the paper and the thoughts that we've seen earlier are actually quite unimaginative. I think we should be standing on our head the idea of a conventional army for Ireland. We don't have the money for it, and we don't have the personnel for it. And, you know, people like Ed Horgan, the peace activist and former army officer, make some very good points about this. We're a small island on the periphery of Europe. If we were invaded, although God knows why we would be, but if we were, we wouldn't stand a chance. And, you know, increasing the military hardware of the army is not going to improve that situation. The reality is the only way we could defend ourselves would be in some sort of guerrilla warfare or local resistance, which is a little bit like the approach that the Swiss take instead of a conventional army. And in that sense, I do welcome the plans to extend the reserve defence forces. I think that's a good thing. I think they have been seriously neglected. There's no question about that. I think the civil defence should be integrated with the reserve defence forces, and I think that volunteer element is to be welcomed. But the idea of a separate air force that we have could ever equip it, or indeed the Navy, and make it into being equal to the rest of Western Europe is just simply laughable. I mean, I would love extra time on this, but I mean, you know, ye love privatisation. Ye love selling things off. I mean, let's face it, we've no effective military aircraft. Even if we had, how would we withstand an invasion at all? We should be concentrating more on rescue-type helicopters, which would provide a better air-sea rescue element, a better air ambulance service, particularly for rural areas and so on. Why don't you put more money into that? Why wouldn't you think about selling off Baldonnel? Give it to your friends in Ryanair. Locate the Army, the Air Corps down in Shannon. Maybe ask the Americans would they mind to leave. There's no imagination in this at all. It doesn't put Ireland centre stage in terms of our defence policy. In actual fact, it tries to move us even further away from neutrality, which is against the wishes of this population.